Greetings. My name is Paul Horton, and I'm here to present an introduction to CoResolve. We had a recording of this earlier today, but we had a little bit of difficulty with the correct Zoom link, and it was a little clunky at the beginning, so I thought I would just re-record and see if we can do a little more fluid job. And then I'll send this link out to anybody that's interested. Again, my name is Paul Horton. I'm a principal member of the Athena Group, a purpose-driven consulting group based in Olympia, working throughout the Northwest. And I'm very pleased to present this to you. I'm going to share my screen now, if all goes well. You should see the presentation there, and let's see if I can make it advance for me. That's always the next challenge. Okay, so this whole presentation should take maybe 45 minutes, not a full hour. So some of the things I'll cover is a bit of the background of deep democracy and CoResolve. CoResolve is also referred to as deep democracy for leaders. I'll tell you a little bit about that. We'll dig in a little bit to some key assumptions about conflict, really this hairy idea of conflict and how we can work with that in a different way. We'll talk about some of the psychology in groups and how we can understand resistance, certain behaviors that people exhibit that aren't always positive inside groups. We'll introduce some of the key parts of the CoResolve toolkit around decision-making, four-step decision-making process. And in that, along the way, I'll talk a little bit about some of the behaviors you might see in groups, so recycling and edge behavior, describe some of that, and also introduce you briefly to another tool that's called the debate that is quite useful for resolving tension. Now, I mentioned that it's called CoResolve Deep Democracy for Leaders. Deep democracy is a meeting facilitation methodology that's really great for civic dialogues and large group discussions where people have come into conversation around complex issues that might have become divisive or stuck, and help them move forward, and at a minimum develop some creative insights, but maybe even transform the issue. Now, CoResolve is an adjunct to deep democracy that is designed specifically for organizational settings, in particular business meetings, right? Business meetings of all kinds. So, there also is a conflict resolution piece in that. So, but first and foremost, it's around meetings. Having better meetings, and you might think about this as I start talk, but either you've been in all kinds of meetings, probably recently, maybe you've facilitated or led those meetings from your position, or maybe you've just participated in those. And so, what have those meetings been like for you? What has been the quality of them? Have they been productive? Have they been helpful? Have they been challenging? Because in a best case scenario, we all know that a meeting should be a great opportunity to generate lots of ideas and input and creative possibilities. Maybe it's to generate, something like a common vision, but in the end, it's around getting to a well-formed decision leading to action. That's what you want, right? That's what I want in the world. I don't want just another meeting. I want meetings that are impactful, that are learningful, and that lead to great decisions, right? So, but it just turns out that all too often, my experience, and I'm sure many of you, some of the following occurs. Like the purpose of the meeting just isn't clear to people. Or there's some lack of real, genuine exchange and creative flow of ideas, or the issues you're discussing just aren't really even relevant to some of the people in the room. Maybe there was a bit of this idea that there's a rubber stamp. We're really just trying to sort of rubber stamp a decision that's probably already been made and doesn't really require my participation or my presence. Or maybe there's this idea that, people are present, they're physically there, but they're not truly there. They're not really emotionally there, right? And there's something, they're having a little side conversation, or they're texting, they're physically there, or they're fidgeting in their chairs, but they're not really in the room. Or there's a lack of buy-in. Or, you know, another one of the classics is that the issue just keeps going around and around. We keep talking about this issue, but we never seem to make progress. We're talking it to death, right? So we've all experienced those bad meetings. And, you know, have you ever heard this term like meeting fatigue, right? You're like, not another meeting. I've heard that so many times, but it's not so much, again, that the meeting itself is a bad idea or that there's anything inherently wrong with humans. There's something potentially wrong with the way we run meetings, or we design and facilitate them. And that's a lot of what we're going to be talking about today. And again, meetings are around leading to some decision, you know. It could be really little decisions, lots of little decisions, or big decisions, like where should this organization be heading? Or where should this coalition be heading? You know, it's like, we seem to be stuck here. What's happening? What's going on with our organization today? And what can we do about it? So there's all kinds of decisions. So this can be used in discussion of almost any kind, big and small, general, very specific, you know, between groups or just between individuals. So there are lots of different contexts where the CoResolve can be very useful. So let's talk a little bit about this whole thing around conflict, right? What is conflict, and you know, why does it matter? It's not really that conflict is a bad thing. It kind of gets a bad rap, right? It's tension, it's unresolved differences, and it shows up in different ways. But again, it's not so much that it's a problem itself, but it's how it occurs, because it's just part of life. It's inevitable, and we're going to experience it. So it's really, you know, has something to do with people's experience with it, their attitudes toward it, right? And so one piece of that is that we've had bad experiences with conflict in the past, right? And so out of that, we've generated some negative feelings, and it's embodied. You know, when we see conflict showing up for what we think is conflict, we almost get this tension in our bodies, and we kind of lose our brains, kind of go offline at that moment. And oftentimes we don't know what to do with it, so we just kind of try to forget about it. And I've certainly had many experiences in my working life in dozens of situations, small and large, where things have become polarized or stuck. People get really dug into their positions. Things might even break down. And, you know, as a manager, I'd become frustrated and didn't know what to do and became uncertain about my own abilities. And, you know, I'm thinking of one experience in particular. It wasn't huge, but I remember it vividly when I was a nonprofit director and we were growing and doing well. So we were hiring new people and we were looking at new roles and responsibilities, and without going into all the gory details, suffice to say that a couple of the staff began to act in ways that were, you know, just counterproductive, let me say. And they weren't necessarily challenging me personally, outright, if you will, but they began to exhibit like curmudgeonly behaviors, and making the difficult process more difficult. So that's a small example, but again, there are many large ones as well. And so, you know, as a result of our negative connotations, as I mentioned, you know, we might not know what to do, but we definitely kind of like, we just want to push it under the rug, hoping it'll go away. But that's just simply not the way the world works. The reverse often happens. It's the longer we avoid the conflict and don't go into it, the bigger the conflict becomes. And the more people begin to avoid each other, the more separate they become from each other, the gap widens, the tension increases, the polarity grows. So this idea of like, you know, if there's that conflict, there's the rub of the conflict. Oh, I'm feeling it. So I kind of put it on the hook, or I try to go, you know, push it under the rug or move away from it and just on to the next agenda item. Well, it's going to come back, right? And often the actual conflict is, it may be between two people, or just maybe there's two camps inside of an organization or a group, but even then, it's never just between two people. It actually extends beyond those sides to other people in the group, and because that's just the nature of group dynamics. And here another key point, and this may seem hard to believe, but the conflict is really the key to successful, healthy organizations in some respect. It's the key to growth. It's the key to innovation, pathways to new insights, to deepening of relationships, in fact. Because no one learns anything without contrasting points of view. Conflicts are, in a sense, they're just conflicting points of view that do not yet surfaced. So the idea of conflict can be a catalyst for growth and learning. So really important. just the idea of any conversation you have, if you think about it, there's there's a training, a wonderful training called Crucial Conversations, but every conversation is crucial if it's an opportunity to either build or erode trust, build or erode relationships, right? So part of our goal is with Deep Democracy is to demystify difficult conversations and scary conversations, and applying very practical tools. So Deep Democracy and CoResolve provides kind of a map for us to navigate this tricky territory here. And so part of what we're doing is, we want to help people recognize that conflict and tension is inevitable, in spite of our best efforts to create some kind of harmony. It's going to be there, and that we can understand the roots of it. We can work with it better. We'll talk more about that. And then through really good meeting and process facilitations, we can bring out the conflict while it's manageable, right? We can help people say what needs to be said early, and we can do this in a way that's skillful, and that we can create more creativity and will lead to growth, as I've said. So just really briefly, a little bit of the history of Deep Democracy. Sort of the founder of some of the principles around Deep Democracy is a guy named Arnold Mindell, and he pioneered a field called process-oriented psychology. So we have individual psychology, already a robust field of study, and he pioneered this idea of process or group-oriented psychology, which is pretty profound, and has it's a very holistic view of group functions in psychology, and also actually rooted in quantum physics. Very interesting. So this couple, Greg and Myrna Lewis, actually met Mindell at a training in Europe, and then took what they learned back to their home in South Africa at a time when this was post-apartheid, sort of the reintegration after years and years of apartheid. And they were invited by one of the largest organizations in the country to do some innovative work. And so the leader of this country was an innovator, wanted to make a meaningful difference, and wanted to sort of, in some sense, level the hierarchy. And so when starting to try and do that, things kind of unraveled, found that it was very difficult to do, and it's because of all of the historic trauma and all the racial tensions. So it permeates the organization, and so trying to push communication down wasn't working. Greg and Myrna Lewis came in and offered a different approach, and ultimately trained over 3,000 people in what became the sort of Deep Democracy approach. And then, that has spread throughout the world, and particularly in Europe and Australia, New Zealand, and many other places. In the U.S., it's still a little bit nascent, and so kind of hoping to spread and support the development of that here. So one of the very helpful tools in the Deep Democracy and the CoResolve toolkit it has to do with understanding resistance, and one of the ways into that is through the metaphor of the iceberg, which probably many of you have seen. Think Freud, if you will. So what that's saying is that, again, above the waterline, in the conscious of an individual, each of us has things we're aware of, right? But these things tend to be the rational parts of ourselves. We're aware of them. But it turns out that probably a vast majority of what makes up you and I is in the unconscious. It's not visible. It's not above the waterline. It tends to be more in the emotional. And so we can then translate that to groups, process-oriented psychology. The idea being here that the same way, in any group, there are things that we are collectively conscious of. And we're conscious of them because we were there when the thing was said, and we were paying attention to it. So now we're collectively conscious of that. And there are things that are in the collective unconscious, right? And that's important for a couple of reasons, So for one is, it affects what's in the unconscious inevitably affects the consciousness of a group, right? Whether we know it or not, or whether we choose to pay attention to it or not. But it's really critical because just in the way that, as individuals, our true potential and our truest wisdom lies in our unconscious. And it's the same with a group. The wisdom in any group lies in that unconscious. And we miss the potential and the optimal functioning of the group when we fail to tap into or when we fail to access that, right? So, and it could be that there are subgroups that are, maybe they're having side conversations because they don't feel comfortable or safe having the conversation in front of the organizational leader for whatever reason. They're having side conversations. Maybe there's a lot of agreement among those groups, but they're actually the majority in this, and now the leadership group is the minority because they don't have access to that, and that's just not good. Another reason why it's critical is that we don't like to be told what to do. I don't like to be told what to do. I don't know anybody that does. It's the same with children because they're not that different in a lot of respects. And children throw tantrums because they aren't listened to, right? And it's not that different in some respect with adults. So when our opinions aren't asked for, when we don't feel like our ideas matter, or we feel like we're marginalized or what have you, or we're not part of the decision, we feel crummy, right? We might feel frustrated or hurt. We might get angry. And, we might not do anything. We might not say anything, partly because it might be career limiting, or it might seem like, oh, that's territory. I don't want to be seen as this person that's always bringing up the contrary opinions. But for whatever reason, we're not bringing it to the surface. So again, it's not available to the group, and so we don't have the benefit of that wisdom. But the other piece is because we're not talking about it, because we're not bringing it up, doesn't mean it goes away. It doesn't just go away. In fact, it stays in the unconscious, right? It stays in that emotional unconscious space there. And over time, the longer it stays there, the longer we feel like we're not being heard or we're being ignored or whatever, marginalized, the longer that shows up as some kind of frustration, and eventually it might bubble to the surface in ways that aren't so pleasant or productive. The boss leaves the room and suddenly, we start having the side water cooler conversations and the gossip occurs, and lobbying occurs, all kinds of things happen, or even in the meetings, it shows up as kind of like curmudgeonly, difficult behavior, and that's not helpful. So one way that the deep democracy thinks about this is almost like they're over time, small things become big things. So first they're little fish that are swimming along underneath the waterline, and eventually they become bigger fish, and they become sharks, and maybe they become whales, the longer things aren't intended to. And we can think about this or better understand it as resistance along a spectrum or along a continuum. And by the idea of resistance, we mean anything that specifically sabotages or goes against the status quo of a decision or action. And initially, these things could be kind of covert and small, or they become larger and more overt. Things over time, things become more inefficient and ineffective. Sarcastic joke is one example. Jokes are great, but over time, sometimes you see there's a little barb or a hook or an edge to the joke. And it's because people don't feel comfortable directly or openly talking about the thing that they need to be, they feel like needs to be brought up. They don't feel like their opinion is being said. So it comes out in these different covert ways. The joke is easier, right? It's unconscious and it's reflexive, but it's a response that's a little easier. So for me, jokes are fine and all that, but sometimes you see there's a certain type of joke or a certain type of banter in groups that just feels uncomfortable, changes the energy in the room, and it's like, okay, so that's not a big deal, but going up the spectrum, you have excuses, another behavior, and excuses are often quite valid, they're reasonable, normal, people have them, but if you start paying attention, you might notice that the same person might bring up another excuse, like, oh, 2 days in a row, or now there's 3 excuses. There's a pattern that's developing here, right? It's moving from a rational kind of process, a conscious process, to one that's more irrational, emotional, unconscious. So when you see a pattern of 3, maybe 4 of these excuses, you start paying attention that there's some signal that there's something that may need to be addressed here. I'm sure as you're going along, you're thinking of your own examples here. The kids not finishing their homework is one, but there's many that happen in workplaces all the time. Another is, here's an example of that where you see the 3 excuses. Another is gossip, right? So this is probably as old as human language, and it's normal. And a lot of the gossip is good stuff, right? There's real important kernels of goodness in the gossip, but the gossip tends to happen in small side conversations or outside the meeting at the coffee machine or what have you. And so they're not being shared with the group. The people that need to hear them aren't hearing them. And this may even be, like I said earlier, the majority opinion, but we don't have access to that wisdom, right? Or people might be lobbying. But then now you move to this communication, poor communication, and worse so communication breakdown, when people actually, there's all kinds of poor communication, which we're all familiar with, which we can name. But then the communication breakdowns where people actually kind of stop talking to each other and stop communicating directly. Then maybe they're using text or email, or they're communicating through a proxy or something like that. Or maybe they stop communication altogether. And again, all too often in organizations and in group settings, certainly with couples, parents and teenagers, you see lots of examples of this. And so there is that idea that moving along this spectrum, it's becoming more inefficient, more ineffective, the more of these behaviors that start showing up, right? And you wonder sometimes, how do we make any progress at all, or how do businesses make profit? But they do, but they're doing so, in a more costly way, in a more painful way, less happy, less healthy, right? The next one is disruption, or kind of going slow. The communication's breaking down further. The behaviors are moving from more covert, more overt. The simple desire to be heard or considered reaches a point where people begin to kind of disrupt the process. Right? You might outwardly sabotage it, or maybe there's more subtle things where they're just moving in a snail's pace, or they're stalling progress, so they create bottlenecks or whatever. So again, not healthy, productive. And then we might see strikes. Happens all the time, and people decide that they can't get their demands met, or something close to them, and then they go on strike. Even a hunger strike at a college, all kinds of situations like this. And then war and withdrawal, really, separation. You see this, in teams inside the same organization. You see it in a lot of multi-stakeholder and community settings. And we see it in our politics in America today, but you also see it in couples. By the time you're going to dispute resolution, it's too late. You've waited too long, or someone decided it's time to leave the organization. I can't work here anymore. Then you have an exit interview, and that's the place where you share what needed to be said all along. But again, too late. So again, to me, this is a really helpful diagnostic tool that helps me look at different levels of dissent or disagreement, or levels of frustration or dissatisfaction in an organization or a group setting, where these behaviors have to do with people not really feeling bought in, right? At one simple level, getting much, much more serious as you go along the spectrum. It's a continuum, but it's not necessarily linear. So our goal is to try and help people say what needs to be said, so that you can lower the likelihood it's going to become higher levels of resistance, leading up to toxicity, before things become too big. Our goal is to, in some sense, go fishing for those little fish before they become big fish. And that leads us to one of the other tools. Again, I think this resistance line is a really lovely tool that I find very helpful, and I have begun over time to understand more deeply, to not only, as I say, diagnose what's going on, but help me discern what would help next. And so, before I talk about the 4-step decision, I will briefly mention this idea of the difference between a majority democracy and deep democracy. So in a majority democracy, which you could argue is the best thing going, maybe not, but it's definitely an improvement over other forms of governance. But the idea still is, in a majority democracy, something like 51% of the population wins. That means something like 49% of the population loses. And when that happens, it's expected that those people that have not won the vote have to go along, right? They have to, be adults and just take the lick, and okay, now we're just all happy with the decisions. But that's just not the way humans are. It's not the way I am. I'm still passionate about my views. I want my opinions and my perspectives to matter. I want them to be heard, and I want to see how they alter the discourse and the decision. But in so many cases, this idea that, okay, we won now, so we discount the minority. And again, there's a lot of wisdom in the minority. So is that a good idea? Probably not. Secondly, it doesn't go away. Just because people have, lost the vote, it stays in the unconscious. It shows up as all kinds of resistance and unhealthy behaviors, okay? So this brings us to the this 4 steps decision-making process. These first 4 steps that I'll describe are all above the waterline. They're kind of rational in the conscious. They take place in the realm of the conscious and the rational. And sitting over all of it is this idea of these meta skills, right? So this has to do with the inner qualities of the leader or the facilitator. So if you're doing any kind of facilitation work, it helps you to understand your neutrality, know how to work with your neutrality. When am I being neutral? When am I being not neutral and stating clearly an opinion or perspective? How do I know when I'm outside of my neutrality? So like the idea, and one way to think about a leader is anybody who's driving an agenda. Maybe you're driving it in a big way, or maybe it's in just a more small, subtle way. But whether you're the chairperson of the meeting, the facilitator, or you're the manager, supervisor, CEO, you're in a meeting, you tend to be driving some kind of agenda. So any leader is anyone driving an agenda. So you've got a viewpoint. So you're not inherently neutral. Even a facilitator has difficulty a lot of times being neutral. So critical meta skill and sort of a cultivated inner quality as well to recognize when you're in and out of your neutrality, and how can you help yourself go back to your neutrality and be neutral. And how do you recognize when you're being triggered and be able to work with that as well. So that's one. And another one is just being compassionate and being open and curious about other people, understanding that we don't have a monopoly on the truth, that there are 5 people in the room, there are 5 unique perspectives. And if I can't come in with that sort of curiosity and that compassion, that I'm probably already in trouble and shouldn't be leading this meeting. A couple other things that are really going to help is being clear about the purpose of the meeting. Excuse me for a moment. We really need to be as clear as we possibly can about the purpose of the meeting and letting people know what the purpose of that meeting is. If the meeting is to really rubber stamp a decision that's already likely been made, then maybe these steps aren't the best steps to use. However, if you're actually genuinely looking to generate all kinds of ideas and brainstorm possibilities to try to better understand all these perspectives so that you can move forward better and smarter, then these are going to be much more helpful tools. So be really clear about the purpose and share that with people so that they understand the purpose of the meeting. And the other one is really understand your rank. Be aware of your rank. And this is, that we could talk about this for a while, but it stands to reason if I am in a room and I'm leading a meeting, but there are my supervisors in the room, or there's several people that are sort of senior to me, that maybe my rank is more inviting other people's perspectives, that my perspective may matter, but it's really about gathering other people's opinions and perspectives, and being very clear when I'm sharing my perspective. And it could be that I am the leader, I am the CEO, and it's been historically a pretty top-down run organization, so people are going to look to me, they're going to expect me to state my opinion and have a strong perspective. I need to be clear about that. Or I'm with clients. And so in that case, my rank in that meeting is like, the client is the king, so I want to hear your perspective first. And there's a nice tool we can use to help us with that, is the idea of leaning in and leaning out. Leaning in when I have an opinion and I'm stating it, I'm not neutral about my opinion or my perspective or my view, and leaning out when I'm inviting others. I'm genuinely, authentically open to hearing other perspectives, so I'm being clear. And I'm doing that almost with physical gesture and with intonation of my voice. I'm leaning in because I want people to really get and be clear about what the situation is right now. Okay, I'm stating my opinion now. I'm leaning out, and maybe I'm changing the intonation of my perspective, or maybe I'm not even saying it. Now I'm leaning out, folks, and I want to hear your views and your perspectives. Okay, so that's really, really critical, and those are sort of underneath that sort of meta skill category, and it can help a lot of times when I think there's this tendency for some people that are positions of authority to fear giving away too much to their staff or the people in the room. Because if I invite all these other perspectives, and then that's going to set up this kind of situation, open the Pandora's box, if you will, where people now feel emboldened, or they feel that they are now, we're just going to level the hierarchy. And so that maybe that's the case. Maybe that's what you want to do. You're co-creating a solution. You're coming together for a collective decision. In that case, great, be clear about it. In the other cases where maybe you just need really good information to inform a decision that's going to be made by you, or maybe by a smaller group, you know, at a later time, be clear with people about that and say, okay, I'm stating my opinion. Now I need yours. And here's what's going to happen with the decision. So just be clear, and it'll help with a lot of that muddiness and a lot of the frustration that ensues. So moving into the 4 steps again, you know, and again, this is around trying to come to good decisions. And so often when we're in conversations in groups, you know, it feels like people are pulling in all these different directions and things are popping in, you know, everywhere. It's hard to get clarity. So we want to help that. And it's also the case where a lot of people, again, as I've said, don't feel safe for any number of reasons to share their views or perspectives, especially if they go against the grain. If they feel really alternative to what seems like a dominant perspective, so they may not do it. So these tools are designed to help people do that, right? So the first step, if I get the screen moving again, is to gain all the views, right? So it seems simple enough, but I want to hear all the views. I want to hear all the perspectives. I want all the wisdom that's in this group. Maybe the majority wisdom, maybe the minority, but I want to hear all of it because I know it's important. So I am using good process to gain all the views, okay? So I might state, depending on my rank and what the situation of the meeting is, I might lean in and say, well, here's my perspective. I might start with mine, and I might lean out and say, now tell me what are all the other views and perspectives? I want to hear those, okay? Or it could be, again, I'm with client, and I start out with, yeah, what are your views and perspectives on this situation or this decision, right? So gain all the views. Number 2 is make it safe to say the no. And this is kind of counterintuitive, but you're actually fishing for alternative perspective. The no in this context is the different or the alternative view, the alternative perspective. So you're making it clear to people that this is valued. I want to hear it. So you might say things like, who else has a different view, or who else has a different perspective, okay? And that conversation might go on. It might be a really group that's really used to having this kind of conversation, so it's easy. It doesn't take a lot of support or facilitation. But in a lot of other cases, it's not, and you need to sort of work it a little bit, and you need to, over time, build people's trust that this is actually going to be a real process. So you're making it safe to say the no. Who else feels a little bit differently than this, right? So that's pretty simple. Very practical, though. In some cases, because it may be hard for people to get there initially, they may not feel safe. Like, I'm not going to say anything until my manager says something, or whatever that is. You might, you know, lean in and say, well, you know, I've had a similar situation. We were developing a strategy, and like this, and we tried it, and it didn't really work, and it kind of led to this. If you can authentically do that with congruity, then yeah, you can do that. Does anybody else feel a little bit that way? You get what I'm saying? So you're making it safe. And the next one is to spread the no, okay? The idea of spread the alternative perspective or the alternative view. So someone might have actually said, yeah, I have a different opinion. You know, I have an opposite viewpoint. And you can say, does anybody else feel a little bit that way? Does anybody else feel a little similar to that? And you might hear something around that. Yeah, I do. I feel a little bit of that, and it might go in another direction. But it doesn't have to be necessarily an outright totally different opinion or in opposition. Actually, it just could be something a little different, a little discordant, maybe a little outlier. It's the Myrna Lewis, the founder of Deep Democracy, calls it the la, la, li. It's a discordant kind of thing that if you pay attention to it, you might notice is a little different. It's like, yeah, I like, what we're talking about. I agree with this topic, but they'll add some other spin to it. They'll come at it from a different edge. So you're noticing, there may be an alternative perspective here that if I work this a little bit more, I can make it safer for this person to say the no by spreading it. And so it's like, then you kind of name that thing. You don't name the individual who said the thing. You said, well, I just heard this perspective is that this strategy might be a different approach or something like that. Does anybody else feel a little bit that way? Does anybody else feel a little bit this way? So you're spreading it. Then you might say that, does anybody else have an alternative perspective? Now you've talked about that for a while. Does anybody else have a different view? What other views are out there? So you're using these steps with real intention. It may seem like you're going slow, but in fact, you're going slow in order to help you go fast later. It's going to matter. Trust me, it's going to make a difference. Now, at some point, I'm going to come back to this. You see, now step 4 is to take a vote, and so now you've had this conversation. You feel like it's come to some natural point where you've gotten a lot of the perspectives in the room. Maybe, people coming back to the same topic, or just you can tell there's a natural close to this. Now it's time for a vote, right? And there's different ways to do votes, but one of the ways the primary way that a vote is done in the deep democracy CoResolve world is, okay, the person who's running this meeting would kind of give a status of where we are. Here's the general decision we're trying to make here. It looks like we've come to this, that most people seem to be aligned with this issue, but there's this other one. So let's take a vote on this issue. Everybody raise their hands if they feel, if they go along with this vote, this decision. And you see what happens in the room. If there's some clear majority, then do you just go ahead and forget everybody else in the room that had their hands down? No, you don't. Because one, there's wisdom in the minority. You want to bring that back to your decision. You want to make sure at least you're considering it. And because people don't like to lose, they don't like to not win the vote, because we're human. And so you turn back to the person one at a time, whoever had their hand up or didn't have their hand up, and say, okay, it looks like the decision's going this way. It's kind of inevitable, but what do you need to come along? We're sorry you lost the vote, but what do you need to come along? And you capture what they said. And then you do that if there's 2 or 3 people that didn't vote yes. You do that to each of them. Then you try to bring that information back to the decision, see if you can alter the decision. If you can, then you come back to the vote and say, okay, now we're going to revote. Hands again, and you might do that a couple times. The theory is that you've at least given them an opportunity to sort of be part of the decision-making process. You've helped them to not get on the resistance line. And it doesn't work 100% with everybody, because some people still might feel disgruntled, but that's kind of how it works in this context. Now, as you go along in this, before you get to the vote, you might notice that you start seeing certain kinds of behaviors. And I mentioned that, like something called edge behavior, where you just notice whatever, that could be subtle and it could be really, really overt behaviors in a group, that like people are moving around their chairs a lot, or they're starting to check their emails, or there's frustration, or whatever. There's any number of behaviors like that. So you're starting to pay attention to that. That can mean a couple things. Maybe it just means that we need a break, and we'll come back because we've been talking a lot. It could be that maybe there's something else going on, and you need to stay in this conversation a little longer. There's something going on in the unconscious that's bubbling around. These little fish are swimming and nibbling, and something to pay attention to that's emotional in the unconscious. And you also might see this idea of cycling. We keep coming back to this issue, and we're going back and forth on this type of topic. Or you start noticing people kind of breaking into camps. This is a real classic one where you notice a polarity, 2 key differences. Like, yep, we're not making progress because we're back and forth on this thing. So that's a point when you might switch to another methodology, which we call the debate, sometimes called the argument. And it's essentially having this same, a conversation around a decision, but in a different way. And so you, as the leader, one of the things you would do is you would kind of note that into the room. Say, I'm starting to see we're going around in circles on this, and I'm kind of seeing two different ideas. emerge here. And I would like to suggest that we have a different kind of a conversation, do a different kind of a process before we go to decision making. Right, so and that can happen like, I worked with a community-based multi-stakeholder coalition about a year ago, and over time, there were fewer people coming from these coalition meetings from government and public institutions. And as we talked through that, I started noticing that, we had a disagreement, something that looked like one polarity, and it was that we should be doing advocacy as a group. We should not be doing advocacy as a group, and political advocacy. And in some sense, this oversimplifies the issue at play, but it didn't matter because it felt like the one that had a lot of energy to it. And if we felt like we took that conversation on, it could help. And so that's kind of a note of polarity that I noticed. And I called it to the group and I said, I think we have to have a different kind of conversation. Or it could be that you're adopting a new strategy or about to, and you're at the conceptual stage and you want to just start talking about pros and cons. So you can kind of separate it, and you can do that, and by doing it in the way I'm going to describe, it can help you avoid it bringing it onto the resistance line and keep it in a rational space. So the way you do this is you have a conversation between two sides. You note the two sides, pros and cons, or advocacy, no advocacy, and you do it one side at a time. So the idea being, we're going to hear all of the perspectives on yes for advocacy. And then when we're done hearing all the perspectives on that one side, then we'll switch over to the no advocacy side. Or we're going to hear all the pros around this strategy, and then we'll hear all the cons around around the strategy. But we're not playing ping pong. We're not going back and forth, back and forth. We're establishing that space in between them. One of the ideas is like we're throwing all the arrows, we're unloading our quiver about this side, and then we're moving to the next side. And you encourage everybody to share a perspective, if they have one, on both sides, creating a little bit of fluidity there so they don't feel locked down to one particular perspective. So it may be because I've established that I'm the leader in this meeting, and I'm going to lean in first, and I'm going to state my opinion first. And so I'm saying, speaking on behalf of advocacy is a good thing. Here's my opinion, my perspective. I'm being very clear, using body language if I need to. And then when I'm done with my perspective, I lean out and I invite other people to have, what are your perspectives on the yes, advocacy is a good thing. And when you feel like you've heard all those perspectives, now you shift to the other side. And as a facilitator, you try to make sure people stay with that process without being too heavy-handed. So now we're in I think advocacy is not a good thing. We shouldn't be doing advocacy. And I'm going to lean in and give my perspective because that's what we've established. And I'm going to lean out and say, now give me your perspective. I want to hear your perspectives. And that might take one round, and it might be super clear where you go next. You might realize that everybody seems to be in agreement. We're not going to do advocacy, or a majority, and you can move to a vote. Or it might need to go around twice, maybe 3 times. If it's more than 3 times, there's something deeper going on, and you probably need some other kinds of process. But in a lot of cases, you won't have to do that. So after you've done the first step of that, first I set up the debate. I describe the polarity or the difference that I see. I ask people, is it okay if we go into this debate? They say yes, and then we start. And then, depending on what my rank is, I might start or I might invite someone else's opinion. First, let's hear all opinions on one side. Let's hear all opinions or perspectives on the other side. And once you've gone through whatever number of rounds you need to, then the next step is to invite everybody to share one insight or one awareness, something that struck them from that conversation. What stood out to them? What hit home? What surprised them? Everybody should share one perspective on that. And then you move to the decision. Okay, and again, you want to come away with a decision that has clear responsibility, accountability, time, output, linked to every decision. So you can start with one small decision and move up to bigger decisions and kind of do it incrementally. But the idea is to make progress. So that's the general flow of that, and it could be, depending on how much energy or tension is around this topic, you might want to start with inviting people to agree on some, these following rules, call them safety rules. But one of them is that idea that, you know, nobody has a monopoly on the truth. Too many different perspectives and truths out there. So, we can't go into this thinking that our truth is the only truth, right? Another one is the intention here is for us to stay in relationship together and not separate. And the third one is the intention is that we can grow. We can even maybe transform this issue if it needs transformation. But if people can't agree to those safety rules, you're probably not ready for this kind of conversation. And then you throw all the arrows, so which is having the argument from each side. Everybody owns a grain of truth. One thing that struck them, stood out for them. Make a decision, and remembering what I described about that decision-making process, that there may be a few people that didn't go along with it, but the majority is clearly going one direction, don't want to leave them behind, need their wisdom, and we want to ask them sort of, sorry you lost the vote. What would help you go along? See if you can bring it back to the decision. See if you need to re-vote. That's the general process. There's a few things I didn't cover, and just because we don't have time, and they're bigger topics. And the first one has to do with this idea of process-oriented psychology. Really gets into some deeper stuff around group dynamics, in particular role theory, which is fascinating, truly fascinating. It was a real groundbreaking learning for me on how we become rigid in our roles. You know, people, and as we do that, people project a role onto us, and we have a hard time shaking that. But a lot of this work is around creating role fluidity. There's more around communication devices. How do you do a much better check-in so you get all the voices in the room? And how can you use that check-in to even set your agenda? How to stop and pause and say, you know, it's kind of a climate report or an audit. Here's where we're at right now. Here's what I see. Is that what you all see before we go on to the next step? So some other really cool parts of the toolkit. And then finally, you know, the CoResolve program includes different components. A significant one being a 2-day intensive training, could be run over 2 continuous days or some half days. Just so you know that the next 2-day training is coming up April 12 and 13 at the Seattle Impact Hub. I'll be doing that with my colleague Sarah Thompson from Halifax. Should be excellent. There are 2 seats left. And there are some assessments, and there's some group coaching, individual coaching. Definitely be able to work with workplace teams, and then people that wish to can move forward to certification to become a CoResolve trainer. That's all I have to share with you. I hope this is useful, and I hope to hear from you, and see if maybe some of you might like to join the training or could use some help in your workplaces. And take care.